Hello everyone and welcome to Visual Radio. Today is, I know it's July 21st because I saw Captain America last night, July 20th, screening in Boston. My guest today is Justin Martin, who has a new book, Genius of Place, The Life of Frederick Law Olmsted. Did I get that right?
You got it right, dead on.
Now, my first question to you, Justin, is Frederick Law Olmsted, an American journalist, critic, public administrator, is a bit different from your previous topics, Ralph Nader, Alan Greenspan. Maybe not too far off, but a little different from these fellows. Why?
Well, I guess part of it is I chose to do a dead figure this time around as opposed to a living figure. So in that case, it was a very different project. You're just sort of poking around in dusty archives as opposed to trying to chase a living figure and pin them down for an interview and so forth. Other ways, though, they're more closely connected than you might think because I like writing books about people who are late bloomers, and all three of those figures. Greenspan was somebody who's a professional jazz musician, member of Ayn Rand's inner circle before he found his way to economics and the Fed. And Nader, was a writer. He wrote Unsafe at Any Speed about auto safety and a consumer advocate, and then of course became a many times presidential fly in the ointment. Olmsted falls into the same category. He's actually connected to those figures from the standpoint he was somebody who did a lot of different things before he did the thing that he's known best for.
And when did he come into his own? What year in his life?
I guess you could say he first started to come into his own when he became a journalist in the 1850s, when he was reporting for the brand new New York Times. That was a really serious job. He was traveling down to the South, writing about the institution of slavery. So that was when he was beginning to come into his own. He came into his own as a landscape architect in 1858 when he started working on Central Park, his first park design and his first masterpiece.
He was almost 40.
Yeah, that's right. He was. So yep, he was well along before he really found his stride.
But it's hard to say when someone finds his stride. Mary Baker Eddy founded Christian Science here in Massachusetts, and she was in her 60s. And for many years, she lived in poverty, and then she became this powerful woman in the 19th century when it was. And this fellow's one of her contemporaries almost. She's a little later than him, but.
No, very true. This was a completely different era when it was possible. First of all, it was possible to do a lot of different things, and so Olmsted did. I mean, it wasn't such a time of narrow specialization when somebody would be, say, I always think of it if somebody is a pediatrician, they want to become a surgeon, people would throw up their arms in the modern era and go, oh, you're going to have to get all kinds of training to make this transition. In Olmsted's day, he went from being a sailor to a farmer to a very noted journalist, and then ultimately to a landscape architect. Different era when it wasn't so much narrow specialization, and actually his park designs really benefited from all this life experience, all this varied career experience he brought to them. The fact he'd done so many things helped him to do really inspired park designs.
Now, designing is big, I understand that. 500 pages on this fellow when there's about 250 there, maybe with Greenspan, and let's see, with Ralph, we're bordering on a little over 300.
Yeah, well, Olmsted merits that and then some. I actually hope it's a jaunty read. He's somebody he's such a grand historical figure, such an important American historical figure, that I felt like he merited a lot of coverage. He merited a lot of ink.
And before your book, what would people do were designers into what he did, of course, with the park?
Yeah, designers were absolutely. Designers are certainly landscape designers, but I think there's whole chapters of his life that have kind of either faded into obscurity or weren't known to start with. So there's a lot of rich territory to be mined.
If an individual like Olmsted lived in the 20th century with television, would he be more notable, or would he just fade into the woodwork, do you think?
I think that he would have. He'd be a notable figure. I mean, we've got notable figures in the arts and architecture. I mean, people like Frank Gehry. So, and yeah.
I apologize. That really
is that Olmsted
happens.
calling, by the way?
That's definitely Olmsted calling.
He's on the line.
I usually turn it down, people, but sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No, I was saying that there's still certainly people that are. certainly architects such as Frank Gehry are certainly well known and acclaimed. So I think Olmsted would still be an acclaimed figure. What I think would have been difficult for Olmsted to do in the 20th, blending into the 21st century, had he lived in this era, would be to do all the different things he did. I don't think that people would be accepting necessarily of a journalist who became a medical administrator and a very able one for a Civil War medical outfit, who then became a gold mine supervisor, who then became a landscape architect. That might have been a tougher sell in our current era.
Yeah, and there wasn't Google there for him to get all the information. And
yeah, that's so true. It's funny. That was one of the things I thought it was really interesting. It's one of the real challenges when he would take a trip. Once he became a landscape architect, if he took a trip to Europe, it was like he felt like he had to have laser focus, because he recognized, particularly with parks, if he visited a European park of some kind, he thought he had to absorb this detail. It wasn't as if he could do a Google search later and get an image of it or anything. And so he'd go on these trips and he'd just fill his mind with stuff. He'd go back to America and have all kinds of rich ideas so he could apply in his park work.
And maybe in this day and age, he might have been more distracted.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, one thing that's for certain is his parks. I mean, I think part of what makes his parks appealing is they're not frenetic in the way of modern life. I mean, they're kind of simple. A lot of design, a lot of thought goes into them, but ultimately they're celebrations of nature with a lot of natural elements. Water, turf, forest, and yeah, there's certainly. They really now in the modern era they stand up in such stark contrast to you could get on the internet and watch something on YouTube, or you can walk through a park. It's a very stark contrast.
With these two books, you interview people with the living. Mm-hmm. Were there people to interview for this book?
There were very much people to interview for this book, and who those people were anybody who's involved in some kind of caretaker role for the many parks around the country. Here in Boston, it's the Emerald Necklace Conservancy at Central Park. In New York, there's the Central Park
Emerald
Conservancy.
Necklace Conservancy,
yeah.
I've never heard of it.
You've never heard of it, really?
No, and we live here. I've been here my whole life.
They're a wonderful outfit, and they're sort of the caretakers of the park. They
a Boston Common.
Exactly, in so many ways. I mean, they're a very estimable outfit. And yeah, with each of these groups, there would be people. They might be tour guides. They might be docents. They might have various roles. They might be public liaisons who knew a lot about Olmsted's plans for the park, and it was essential. I mean, I could read all I wanted to about these park creations. I could read his letters, I could read the park designs. It was essential to visit the parks, and it was essential to visit them in the company of someone who really could say, that element over there is really as Olmsted originally intended it. This is what it's meant to achieve. And I learned wonderful stories that I never could have learned about the parks and their design by interviewing people. So, yeah.
And the general public, not everyone, but people walk through these beautiful experiences and they don't think about the thought behind the park.
Very true. No, these were intensely designed spaces, and Olmsted, in an era before this term existed, he thought very much about user friendliness. I mean, that was one of his hallmarks for the parks. And these parks were designed so that people could have an experience that they weren't even aware that they were being guided through. And I'll give just one example. My wife grew up in Rochester, across the street from Highland Park and Olmsted Park in Rochester. As a little girl, she remembered there was this kind of channel. It was a set of trees that were growing in two parallel rows down this hill. What an incredible place to go sledding. What an incredible place during the summer to roll down the hill between the two trees. She had no idea who Frederick Law Olmsted was. She never even heard of him until she was an adult. But his design was really informing her use of the park, 100 years after he died. And that's sort of an example of how these parks are very rigorously designed, but not in a way that somebody would necessarily pick up on.
So 100 years later, people realize the value of.
And then what Greenspan-He's done, man.
That was Alan took a tumble.
That's Alan Greenspan. He just really.
I'm going to get up and get him in a second, but that was interesting.
I like that. That was some kind of karma got him.
I didn't touch it either. I didn't just that was the spirits up there working. That was Yosemite.
Yeah.
But these parks, 100 years later, there are people that realize the value of the work that went into them, so they leave them alone.
Yeah, the Olmsted's parks, I mean, it's really a tribute to a lot of cities around the country. Boston, certainly, New York, Buffalo. It's a long list of cities that really pride themselves on these parks and have been really good caretakers. I mean, you'll find examples all around the country of parks that, Olmsted parks that are in somewhat of a diminished condition. But what's really impressive is all these years later, how many of these parks are pretty well maintained.